Merritt Causey didn't wait at the gate. He opened it himself, the way a man opens something he already considers his own, and walked across the gravel yard with two men behind him, and a folder tucked under his arm that he held like it contained something he expected her to refuse. Sylvie Lamont was in the creek pasture when she heard the truck, 30 yards from the house. Kneeling beside a fence post she'd been trying to reset for 2 days, with tools borrowed from a neighbor she'd only just met. She'd been on the property 4 days. She knew almost nothing about it. She stood up slowly and watched the 3 men cross toward her. Miss Lamont. His voice carried the particular ease of someone who rarely had to raise it. I'd like to have a word with you about the property. She pulled off one work glove, set it on the fence post. You already know my name. Small county. He's word travels. Merritt Causey was 62 years old, built wide through the chest, with the tan of a man who spent time outdoors but not doing physical work. He had 640 acres in Cutter County and had been the largest private landowner in the county for 11 years. He looked at her the way men sometimes looked at problems they expected to resolve quickly. I've made you a fair offer, he said, before she asked a single question. Given the situation, I thought it best to come in person. She was 27 years old. She had $51 in her checking account. She had 9 pigs that 3 different people in town had already told her were a waste of feed. She had a dead woman's farmhouse and 70 acres of creek bottomland and a bank foreclosure proceeding with 49 days left on the clock. She looked at him. Get off my property, she said. That moment, a Thursday afternoon in early October, the fence post still leaning, her knees still dirty from the creek mud, is where this story really starts. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in late August, while Sylvie was finishing the last week of her teaching contract. She'd been a high school science teacher in Jefferson City for 4 years, and she was good at it, and she'd been planning to stay until something better came along, which was the kind of plan that sounds like a plan, but isn't really one. She was standing in the school parking lot when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, and the man on the other end identified himself as an estate attorney and told her that her great-aunt Frances had died and left her a farm. She had to sit down on the curb. Frances Lamont had been her father's aunt, an unmarried woman who had farmed alone in Cutter County for 30 years. Sylvie had met her twice, once at a family reunion when she was 9, and once at her father's funeral when she was 19. She remembered a small woman with very straight posture who shook hands instead of hugging and said what she meant without decoration. She hadn't known Frances was sick. She hadn't known much about her at all. The estate attorney's name was Gerald, and he was patient in the way of someone who had already prepared for a short call. The property was 72 acres of creek bottomland outside the town of Halden, farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, 9 pigs, and according to the documents he'd emailed her, $38,000 in debt attached to the property, with a bank proceeding already in motion. 9 pigs, Sylvie said. There was a pause. Yes, ma'am, Ossabaw Island hogs, 9 breeding females. What happens to them if I don't accept? They'd be considered assets of the estate, likely sold or disposed of with the remaining property. She sat on that curb for a long time after the call ended. A teacher's salary in Missouri did not leave room for inheriting debt. She had a car with a cracked windshield she'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. She had student loans that showed up in her bank statement the same day every month, like a polite but firm reminder. She was not in a position to inherit anything, much less a farm she'd never seen. She drove out on a Saturday to look at it before she made any decision. The farm was at the end of a county road that turned to gravel a mile before the gate. She got there at 7 in the morning because she'd left before dawn and gotten turned around once when the GPS lost signal past the ridge. The sky was gray and cool, the kind of early September morning that still smells like summer, but carries something else underneath it. She heard them before she saw them. A low, rolling sound from somewhere past the barn, not loud, closer to a hum than anything else, something between contentment and communication. She followed the fence line toward it. The 9 pigs were in the lower pasture near the creek, spread out in the morning light, foraging along the bank with a slow and purposeful energy that surprised her. They were not large animals. Compact, heavy-boned, with coarse, dark hair and dished faces and ears that fell forward over their eyes. Their legs were short, and their bellies were close to the ground. They moved through the creekside vegetation, the way animals move when they know exactly what they're looking for. One of them, the largest, a broad-backed female with a pale scar along her right shoulder, lifted her head and looked at Sylvie directly, held the look, then went back to foraging. Sylvie stood at the fence for a long time. She called Gerald that afternoon and accepted the inheritance. She gave notice at the school on Monday. She paid the last month on her apartment, packed her car and a rented trailer, and moved into Frances Lamont's farmhouse in the first week of October. The house smelled like cedar and old paper and something herbal she couldn't identify. The kitchen faucet ran rust-colored for 3 minutes before it ran clear. One of the porch steps flexed dangerously under her weight. The water heater was original to the 1980s and delivered lukewarm at its best. She set her boxes down in the living room and stood there for a while. Then she went out to check on the pigs. The nearest neighbor was a man named Victor Kovar, who farmed 80 acres a mile east and had been there for 40 years. He appeared at her fence line on day 6 without calling ahead, which she'd already learned was how people operated out here. He was in his late 70s, the kind of old that carries real weight, deliberate in his movements, economical with words. He stood at the fence and looked at the pigs for a full minute without speaking. "Your aunt's animals," he said finally, not a question. "Yes, I'm trying to figure out what I have." He looked at her sideways. His accent was faint but present. "Czech," she learned later, "come to Missouri 4 decades ago and never left. You know the breed?" "I've been reading about them." He made a sound that wasn't dismissal and wasn't approval, just acknowledgement. Frances kept very good records. He looked at the scar-shouldered female who had approached the fence with the same direct attention she'd shown Sylvie on the first morning. "That one is the oldest. 8 years. She's had 5 litters." "I noticed her first," Sylvie said. Victor looked at her with pale gray eyes that were very direct and somewhat tired, the eyes of a man who had been watching things for a long time and had made peace with what he saw. "Your aunt had a breeding arrangement," he said. "A man named Prudhomme, 2 counties east. He has a registered boar of the same line. Frances paid him a small fee each season, and he trailered the animal out for 6 weeks, kept the bloodlines clean." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, a name, a phone number, handwritten. "He knows about Frances. He'll honor the arrangement if you ask him." She took the paper. "Why are you telling me this?" Victor looked at the pigs again. "Because Frances would have wanted someone to," he said, "and because no one else around here knows enough to." He left without much more than that. She called Prudhomme that evening. He was a quiet man, somewhat gruff, who said he was sorry about Frances, and yes, he'd honor the arrangement, same terms. She thanked him and wrote everything down. The first person who was openly dismissive about the pigs was a man named Lester Poole, who ran the feed store in Halden. She went in her second week for supplies and made the mistake of asking about Ossabaw nutrition requirements by name. Lester was in his mid-50s, solid behind the counter, with the comfortable authority of someone who had been the most knowledgeable person in this specific room for a very long time. He looked up when she said the breed name. "Heritage stock," he said. "Frances's animals." "Yes, I'm keeping them." He leaned back on the counter. "You know those things don't grow right for market. Wrong body type. Too much fat in the wrong places. Processors won't touch them. Commercial buyers won't touch them." "I'm not interested in commercial markets." "Then you're not interested in making money." He said it without cruelty, just as fact. "There's no specialty market worth chasing in Cutter County. That's not a business. That's an expensive hobby. I've read that registered Ossabaw have sold to specialty charcuterie operations and research institutions at 3 to 4 times commercial pork pricing," she said. He looked at her. "Where'd you read that?" "Scientific literature, mostly, and the Livestock Conservancy database." He sold her the feed. She felt him watching as she loaded her car. The farmhouse roof was the first real problem. She discovered the soft spot over the back bedroom on day 8 when she put her hand through the ceiling reaching for a light fixture. She spent 2 evenings watching repair videos on her phone, then spent 6 days doing the work herself with salvaged materials from the barn. Her hands blistered and then oozed over. She burned through her $51 in the first week and started living on canned soup and eggs from 4 hens that had apparently been surviving unnoticed in the shed beside the barn. She sold her television to a woman in town for $35. She wasn't miserable, exactly. Something about the tiredness at the end of each day felt different from 4 years of grading papers and managing other people's children's anxieties. She didn't try to explain it. She just noticed it. She named the scar-shouldered female crook. She told herself she was keeping professional distance and that naming animals was a mistake. She named 2 more by the end of the second week. She knew she'd eventually name all 9, and she accepted this about herself. Victor came back on a Tuesday with a jar of something preserved, tomatoes, she thought, or possibly peppers, and stood at her fence again. They talked for 40 minutes. He told her about the creek bottomland, how it flooded in spring and held water late into summer, how most people in the county considered it a liability. He told her Francis had used it for winter forage, letting the pigs range freely along the bank when the ground elsewhere was frozen hard. She said the pigs knew things about that land that took her 10 years to learn to see, Victor said. What kind of things? He was quiet for a moment, choosing precision over speed. There are roots along the creek bank, tubers, things the pigs locate and eat that other animals would not find or would not know to eat. Frances tracked it in her notebooks. The meat from animals that forage that bank has a flavor that's, he stopped, different. She had a chef from St. Louis drive out once to taste it. He offered her a contract. She turned him down because she wasn't ready. Sylvie looked at the creek. Was she ever going to be ready? Victor looked at the sky. I think she got sick before she got there. She went inside that night and found Frances's notebooks. They were in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. 11 of them, cloth-covered, dating back 19 years, written in a small and very precise hand. She sat at the kitchen table and read until 2 in the morning. Frances had recorded everything: breeding cycles, forage observations, the creek's seasonal behavior, flavor notes from informal tastings, a gradual building understanding of what the animals were doing on the land and why. In one entry from 7 years ago, Frances had written, "People here see mud and mosquitoes. They see wasted acres. What they don't see is that the mud and the mosquitoes mean the soil is alive in a way their fields stopped being 20 years ago. The pigs know this. I'm still learning to know it." Sylvie read that entry 3 times. She added the notebooks to the binder she'd started for the farm records. Then she went to sleep on the living room floor because she hadn't bought a bed frame yet. The trouble arrived on a Thursday morning, which was when Merritt Causey came through her gate without waiting. She told him to leave. He set his folder on her fence post and left, and she let it sit there for a full day before she brought it inside. The offer was for the property at roughly 30 cents on the dollar, enough to clear the debt, not enough to start anything else. She put it in a drawer, then she called the Livestock Conservancy. The woman she eventually reached was named Donna, and she worked in the registry division, and when Sylvie described the herd, 9 breeding females, documented lineage going back to a verified importation, 19 years of farm records. There was a pause on the line that told her she'd said something that landed differently than she'd expected. "Are you aware of how few active Ossabaw herds exist in the state?" Donna asked. "I'm starting to understand it. Can you send photographs and whatever documentation you have on the lineage?" She spent 2 evenings photographing every animal from every angle and scanning every page of Frances's notebooks. She sent everything on a Friday and went out to check on Crook in the dark, standing at the fence with a flashlight. Crook came to the wire and pressed her flat, dished face against it, with the same focused attention she always brought to everything. "I have no idea what I'm doing," Sylvie told her. Crook's ears moved. Donna called 6 days later. Her language was careful and professional, but underneath it there were sentences with weight to them. Things like, "We were not aware of any active herd in this part of the state, and your photographs suggest an exceptional example of the traditional phenotype." And at the end, one sentence Sylvie read from the email 4 times while standing at the kitchen counter. "If your animals are who we believe they may be, This herd could represent one of only 2 active registered populations remaining in Missouri. She put her phone face down on the counter and went outside and stood next to Crook for a while. She wrote back to Donna that evening and asked about formal registration. The first piglets arrived on a November morning from the female she'd eventually named Dusk, the quietest of the 9, the one who stood slightly apart from the others during feeding. Sylvie had been watching her for 5 days. She'd set alarms through the night and gone out twice and seen nothing. She came back from fixing the barn latch at 6:40 in the morning, and there were 3 of them. By noon, there were 8. She sat outside in the cold for most of it, close enough to monitor but far enough not to interfere. Her handwriting in the notebook got worse as the day went on because her fingers were stiff. She didn't care. 8 piglets, all nursing, all moving. She called Victor that evening. 8, she said when he picked up. All from Dusk, all healthy. There was a silence long enough to tell her he was genuinely moved by it. Then, good, the word carried more weight than most people's longer celebrations. She went to sleep that night with the feeling of something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite happiness. More like the sensation of watching a bet begin to pay out. Early, preliminary, nothing you'd count on yet. But real. The next trouble came by certified mail. The Cutter County Agricultural Water Use Board wrote to inform her that her property had been flagged for a compliance review of her water management practices under a county ordinance, and that she had 30 days to prepare documentation for a formal inspection. She recognized one of the signatures immediately. She sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes without moving. Then she called Victor. "Causey has people on that board," she said when he picked up. 3, Victor said. "He's had them for 8 years. What does the review actually require?" "Documentation that your use of the creek bottomland does not negatively impact the county watershed. Historical records. Evidence of current management practices." A pause. If the documentation is incomplete, or if the inspector is motivated to find it incomplete, they can extend the process long enough to push past your bank deadline. She thought about the 49 days she'd had when Causey walked through her gate, and how many were left now. "What's the bank deadline?" Victor said. 22 days. Silence. "Victor, what documentation do I have that's airtight?" "Francis's notebooks," he said immediately. 19 years of water observations, seasonal flooding records, forage impact data. Combined with the right expert assessment, it's a stronger record than the county has. "Who's the right expert?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a woman at the University Extension, Dr. Asha Renner. She specializes in heritage breed land use. I've seen her work. She doesn't cut corners." Sylvie called Dr. Renner the next morning. She didn't read from a script, but she'd thought carefully about what to say and said only what was true. 9 Ossabaw Island hogs, 19 years of documented forage records on creek bottomland, a compliance review with a timeline that was not accidental. Dr. Renner was quiet for a moment. "Ossabaw in Cutter County?" "Yes. I'll come Saturday." Dr. Renner arrived in a truck that had clearly covered a lot of unpaved miles. She brought equipment and a small orange notebook and walked the creek bottomland with the methodical attention of someone who had been doing this work long enough to trust what she saw without needing to perform the trusting. She examined each animal. She walked the bank. She read 6 of Francis's 11 notebooks without being prompted, holding them at angles to catch the morning light. At the end of 3 hours, she sat on a log at the creek's edge and wrote steadily for a while. "Your aunt was managing this bottomland as a functional riparian buffer," she said finally. "The pig's foraging pattern along the bank controls invasive growth and maintains natural filtration into the creek system. It's not an accident. The notebook shows she understood it and managed deliberately toward it." She closed her notes. "Your property contributes positively to the watershed. An honest inspection would not find a violation. It would find a model. Will you put that in writing? I'll have a formal assessment to you in 5 days, cited in your compliance response. If they want to challenge my methodology, they're welcome to try." A pause. "I've been doing riparian assessments in this county for 14 years. Merritt Causey's drainage expansion project received a review exemption from this same board 9 years ago. The board approved it in 2 weeks. She looked at Sylvie. I know what this inspection is. Sylvie filed the compliance documentation on a Monday. Victor contributed his own survey records from a property boundary assessment 2 decades prior, which included creek flow data the county could not dismiss. She retained an agricultural attorney in the county seat, a woman named Maureen Vick, who knew county board procedure better than anyone Sylvie had spoken to, and charged less than her city counterparts, who filed a procedural objection when Causey submitted a quiet request for an expedited review. The expedited request was denied 2 days later. She found this out from Victor, who found it out the way things got found out in small counties. Donna called from the registry in the middle of that same week. The formal application was moving forward. The lineage documentation was exceptionally complete. The committee had noted Frances's notebook specifically, and she had received an inquiry from a specialty food sourcer named Graham Selter, who worked with farm-to-table operations across the Midwest and had been looking for a verified Ossabaw supplier for 2 years. He'd like to contact you directly, Donna said. Sylvie wrote the name down. Then she pulled 3 index cards from the kitchen drawer and wrote herself notes about what she needed to say and what she absolutely could not say. At the bottom of the 3rd card, she underlined twice, "Do not sound desperate." She called Graham Selter on a Thursday morning. She told him about the herd the way she'd learned to speak about it, specific, documented, precise. She mentioned the 19 years of forage records. She mentioned the creek bottomland and the riparian buffer function, and the fact that the land had not been touched by the dry summer that had hit the rest of the county hard. She told him about November's 8 piglets. He was quiet for a moment. "How far out are you from Halden?" "About 6 miles. "I'll be in the region in 2 weeks," he said. "Could I come out?" She looked at her index cards. "I can make that work," she said. She hung up and let out a breath that had been building for a long time. Graham Selter arrived on a Tuesday morning in a dark truck, younger than she'd expected, early 40s, with the watchful stillness of someone still in the process of deciding things. He shook her hand at the gate and looked at the pigs before he said anything else. She showed him Frances's notebooks first. He read slowly, turning pages back, comparing entries. He asked 2 questions, one about a breeding notation in the 7th notebook and one about the origin of the founding stock. She answered both. The second one she'd researched specifically because she'd anticipated it. He closed the last notebook and looked at her. "Tell me about the market as you understand it," she told him. She was honest about what she knew and honest about what she was inferring, because she had decided she would rather be honest and lose the conversation than win it in a way that fell apart later. The specialty market was niche but growing. Documented heritage lineage with verified forage-based management commanded premium pricing. She had already made 2 sales from November's litter at prices that confirmed the tier she was in. He asked for the numbers, she told him. His face didn't move much. She took that to mean the numbers were in the range he'd been considering. "What do you need?" he asked. She answered directly. "I have a bank deadline in 11 days. I need a contract with terms that demonstrate revenue sufficient to service the debt." He looked at the notebooks. He looked at the creek. Crook was at the near fence, conducting her assessment of the visitor with the focused and unhurried attention Sylvie had come to think of as the breed's particular form of intelligence. "I work with 6 restaurant groups and 2 private producers," Graham said. 3 of those groups have been asking me about verified Ossabaw for 18 months. The demand is real. What I don't have is a supply I can stand behind." He paused. "I want to bring Dr. Renner out for an independent assessment before I make an offer. I've worked with her before. If her red matches the documentation, I'll have terms to you within a week." 8 days. She did the math. "Yes," she said. Dr. Renner came back 4 days later and spent 2 hours with the animals. She delivered her assessment to Graham that evening. He called Sylvie the next morning. He named a per-animal price, a contract term, minimum annual volumes with growth provisions in years 2 and 3. She did the math once, then again to make sure she hadn't made an error. The annual revenue, even at minimum volumes, was more than twice what she needed to service the debt. There was room for the barn roof repair she'd been postponing, Room for better fencing equipment instead of salvaging it piece by piece. Room, eventually, for help with the heavy work that her body had started to issue quiet complaints about. That's a real number, she said. She said it before she could decide not to. Yes, Graham said. It is. And I want to be clear about something. What you've documented here, what you've built in 2 months on land that everyone else in that county has written off, that's not common. A pause. I'll have a draft agreement to you tomorrow. She signed the contract at the kitchen table, alone, with the lamp on, and Frances's first notebook opened beside her to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise and absolutely certain of itself. She read one paragraph. Then she set the contract in the binder and called the bank. The bank contact was a woman named Carol, who had been professionally kind to Sylvie for 2 months, in the way bank contacts are kind to people they expect to default. She answered on the second ring. Sylvie gave her the numbers. A long silence. Could you repeat the annual projections? Sylvie did. Another silence, longer. I'll need to see the actual agreement, Carol said. But based on what you're describing, she stopped. When she spoke again, something in her voice had shifted, the professional patience recalibrating into something closer to respect. The bank should be satisfied. Sylvie thanked her. She hung up. She sat at the table for a while. Outside, in the creek pasture, Crook was doing her evening rounds along the fence line, the same deliberate patrol she ran every day at dusk, checking each section of wire with the proprietary attention of an animal who has decided this is her land and takes the responsibility seriously. The compliance inspection came 3 days later. The inspector, a county employee who was not, Sylvie could see, entirely comfortable with his assignment, spent 90 minutes on the property with Dr. Renner's assessment in hand, and Victor's survey records, and Frances's 19 notebooks organized in binders on the kitchen table. He found nothing. He left without comment. The board closed the review the following week, 4 votes to 3. She found out from Victor, who found out the way things got found out. The 4th vote had been a board member who had looked at the documentation and decided her name was not worth the alternative. Victor came for dinner that Saturday, as he had most Saturdays since November. He brought bread. She made soup. They sat at the kitchen table and talked about the land the way people talk about something they both care about without needing to announce it. Causey will leave it alone now, Victor said. His East Acreage loan got extended on worse terms than he expected, Sylvie said. I heard that from Lester at the feed store. Victor made a sound. He overextended on the drainage project. Dry year made it worse than the projections said. He was quiet for a moment. He was not wrong that conventional operations struggle on wet land. He was wrong that the wetland itself was the problem. Sylvie thought about that. She thought about a man who had built his entire framework around a particular idea of what farming was supposed to look like, and how much of his certainty had been borrowed from that framework rather than from the land itself. She didn't feel triumphant thinking about it. She felt something more complicated and harder to name. In January, Lester Poole called her. His tone was different than it had been in the feed store. Not warmer, exactly. More careful. I have a family I'd like you to meet, he said. Neighbors of mine. 3rd generation on creek property about 8 miles south. They've been in trouble for 2 years, and they don't know there might be another way. She met Vince and Lucille Hartley on a Saturday morning in February. They were in their late 50s. Vince quiet and deliberate, Lucille watchful, and they had 40 acres of creek bottomland they'd been trying to drain for a decade. They stood in Sylvie's driveway and looked at the pigs with the expression of people who wanted to hope and weren't sure they'd earned the right to it yet. She showed them everything. Not the polished version, the actual version, the fencing repairs, the rotation system, the breeding records. She showed them Frances's notebooks because she had decided those notebooks were not only hers, they were instruction, and instruction was meant to be used. She showed them the mistakes she'd made, and what they'd cost her, and how she'd corrected them. The land you've been trying to drain, she said. Stop draining it. Vince looked at her. I know, she said. Every instinct you have about farming says wet ground is wasted ground. 30 years of conventional wisdom says the same thing. She looked at the creek pasture, but conventional wisdom gave you 2 bad years in a row. The wet ground is not your problem. It's the only part of your land that hasn't failed you yet. Lucille looked at her, then at the pigs, then back. How long before it becomes something, she said. Longer than you want, Sylvie said. Shorter than you're afraid of. She sold them 2 breeding females in March, young animals from November's litter, healthy and well-established, at below market price. Not charity. A condition. They would use her record-keeping system, share their breeding data with the Conservancy for registry purposes, follow the riparian management protocol she wrote out for their specific land, and when they had progeny to sell, they would sell them at fair prices to other struggling families in the county, not to commercial operations. Vince started to say something about the price. Let me finish, Sylvie said. One herd doesn't preserve a breed, and the knowledge Frances kept in those notebooks, what she understood about this land, that doesn't belong only to me. It waits in notebooks and in the behavior of animals and in soil that hasn't been ruined yet. I'm passing it forward because that's the only thing that makes it last. She thought about Victor as she said it, about a man who had appeared at her fence on day 6 with a name and a phone number and said things he hadn't needed to say to someone he'd only just met. She hadn't told him yet about the Hartleys. She would. Saturday. She was 28 years old now. She had 17 pigs and 2 long-term specialty contracts and a heritage conservation grant that had come through in January and covered the barn roof and a proper farrowing structure and real fencing equipment. She had Victor for dinner on Saturdays. She had 11 notebooks of her own, stacked beside Frances's 19 on the kitchen desk. She had mud on her boots at 7 in the morning and sometimes still at 8 at night. None of it had been clean. She had been wrong about things and had to go back and be wrong again before she found the right direction. The mistakes were in the notebooks, crossed out and footnoted, still readable. She hadn't removed them. A record without them wouldn't be honest, and an honest record was the only kind that actually helped someone else find their way through the same terrain. That was the thing she kept coming back to when she tried to understand what had happened on this farm since October. Not the contracts or the registry or the board review. Not even the pigs themselves. The thing that kept surprising her was this. The knowledge Frances had spent 19 years building had not disappeared when Frances died. It had waited. In the notebooks, in the behavior of the animals, in the specific quality of bottomland soil that nobody else had thought was worth understanding. It had waited for someone patient enough to look. She put her hand on the fence rail in the early evening light. Crook came to her side of the wire and stood there, and they were both quiet for a while, in the way of 2 creatures who had arrived at something together, without being able to say exactly when it happened. Then Sylvie went inside, made tea, too strong, as always, and she had not once apologized for it, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened notebook number 12 to a clean page. She had things to write.